Firstly, it's a great pleasure to be here. I love coming to Chicago, even though I have terrible experiences every time at the airport. But I'm particularly pleased to be here for today because I think the work of A Better Chicago is fantastic and much needed. And I wanted to congratulate Liam and the whole team on putting the initiative together in such an imaginative way. I think it really couldn't be more important for the future of Chicago than to address some of the big problems of the education system. So thank you for the invitation. It's an honor, genuinely. I've lived in America since 2001. And not long after I got here, the government passed legislation to try and raise standards in education. You remember this, don't you? It was called No Child Left Behind. In a flight of irony, it was called this, because the upshot is that it's left millions of children behind, which I know is not a very attractive name for legislation. Millions of children left behind, I see that. But it wasn't intentional. I'm going to prove this to you in a minute, but it wasn't intentional. No, if you look at the Education Reform Act, the ESEA in America, it's full of great intentions. The problem was in the strategy that was adopted. The strategy was to standardize and test and test and keep testing. And it simply hasn't worked. It hasn't worked now, and it never will work. And there are reasons why it won't work. So I'm going to try and explain what I think these reasons are and what the alternative is. When No Child Left Behind became the law, the strategy of standardization and of testing wasn't taken care of by the government. They left it to the private sector. And the result is that in America now, there is this massive industry in testing, which has very little to do with the principles of teaching and learning. There is a global context for the changes to be made in America, and there's a local manifestation of them. And I think on both counts, it's important to rethink some of the basic principles. The globalization of the economies has thrown countries into direct competition, and particularly it's put an emphasis on the need to get more and more kids to college, because the assumption is that we need a much more highly educated workforce to compete. So all the talk is about competition. It's important to reference that this shift is global, it has an economic base, and the solution in America has been to standardize. Children, young people, are learning machines. They love to learn. Human beings are voraciously interested in learning at all ages. When kids start to lose their appetite, ironically, usually, is when we start to educate them, when they get to school. And I don't say this in criticism of teachers or school principals or superintendents or anybody. It's the system that creates the problem for the teachers as well, because we've invented organizational devices in school which are out of tune with the natural patterns of learning. Like, for example, in schools, we sit kids down for hours and hours on end. Why? And then they start to fidget, so we medicate them because they seem to be bored. Why? Because it's boring. We cut programs that may energize them. We cut physical education programs, we cut arts programs, we cut recess, we cut playtime, and we sit them down and we just keep testing them till they can't stand it and we can't, and we think, well, what's the problem here? Well, they're having the problem you would have. We educate kids by age group all the time. Why? All the 6-year-olds together, all the 8-year-olds together. Why? We don't do that outside school, ever, do we? Kids don't go home to a separate compound for 6-year-olds, do they? Where they're not allowed to mingle with other 7-year-olds, because that's next year. We don't do that. It's just something we do at school. And we don't have to. It's not required by law that we do it. We just do it because we just always did it. It's one of those habits, like smoking. We can't break it. We divide the day up into 40-minute bits and keep ringing bells, and you have to stop what you do to go and do something else. Why? If you ran your business like we run most schools, you'd be bankrupt in a month. You would. You know, if every 40 minutes somebody rang a bell and everybody had to stop what they were doing and go and do something else in another part of the building with another group of people, you'd be out of business. You'd be demoralized in no time. So I'll say, we can't work like this. Well, nor can schools. If you change the system, a lot of these problems that seem so intractable actually go away. If you want to transform education, what I'm saying is Don't keep doing what we've done. It won't work. The answer is not more testing. It's not a bigger emphasis on reading and math. It's not cutting arts programs. It's not cutting recess. It's not cutting physical education. It's getting back to basics about what it is that engages kids in learning and makes them want to learn. Because they do want to learn, they want to get on. But they need conditions under which that will happen. And we've created conditions where it doesn't. So if we're going to reinvent education, we should, let's invent it on these principles, not the old ones. Let me just tell you quickly what they are. The first of them is this. The current system is based on the principle of conformity. It just is. I don't mean social conformity. I'm not saying the opposite is disruption. I'm not saying just cut people loose and let them do what they want. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about conformity of ability. In our education systems, in Europe and here in the US, there is an implicit conception of ability and intelligence to which kids, if they're going to succeed, are expected to conform. There are a lot of different ways of describing it, but the shorthand we all use is academic ability. There's a terrible tendency to equate academic ability, in particular, with intelligence in general. Academic ability is very important, but it's a facility for a certain type of critical reasoning. It's very important, but it's not the whole of intelligence. And people who have other interests, who display other sorts of appetites, different sorts of abilities, are likely to be excluded from that conception or to be put on remedial programs or just thought they're not very bright. Human talent is tremendously diverse. Now, this is the point. Our systems are based on conformity, but human talent is tremendously diverse. It's a hallmark of human life that we celebrate diversity. But our schools have become preoccupied with a type of intelligence. And it's not an accident because the whole system was designed to get kids to college. Now, again, I'm not knocking college, but there are other routes to a successful life. And sometimes going to college isn't the answer, and sometimes going right away is not the answer. The whole point is to see talent and passion as a personal commitment and to treat kids as individuals, but with, obviously, a common enterprise. The second principle on which education is based is compliance. So compliance has become a big thing. And again, the opposite is not disruption. The opposite of conformity is diversity, to me. The alternative principle to compliance is creativity. Human beings are abundantly creative. I mean, that's why we're in a theater and all the other animals are outside. So conformity is the current principle. I think we should be celebrating diversity of talent, of ability, of passion, of interest, of occupational choices. And our communities, by the way, depend on all of that. Compliance is the signature. That's what standardization is about. And we make a big mistake, I think, when we confuse standardizing with raising standards. Actually, more often than not, standardization leads to the lowest common denominator. The highest forms of achievement are when people are impassioned about what they do and when they're engaged and interested. And the third principle on education systems is that life is linear, and it's absolutely not. Life is not a linear process. It's an organic process. You create your life as you live it, and so do our children. And if we groom them, so to speak, in principles of conformity, compliance, and linearity, don't be surprised if we get what we get, which is an awful lot of kids leaving school not knowing what to do next, not feeling confident to do anything at all, and too many of them ending up on the wrong side of the law. You know, it'd be totally wrong, wouldn't it, to say that if you leave high school early, you go to jail. Of course that's not true. There are wonderful people who've led extraordinary lives who did not complete high school. What is true is a very high proportion of people in the correctional system did not complete high school. About 60% of people in jail did not get a high school diploma, did not graduate high school. I could show you a film that was made in 1962 about the problems of kids dropping out of education, and if you didn't see the grainy movie, if you read the script instead, you'd have thought it was made last week, 50 years ago, and we're still trying to learn the same lesson, to engage kids, to offer them personal programs, to empower teachers, to see education as a creative process, to look at real innovation in the system, not just to keep trying to do the same thing over and over again and keep testing it until it dies. But there are principles that work, and they're at work in the successful schools in the city already. Personalizing, customizing, a broad curriculum, empowering teachers, investing in professional development, close links with the cultural community, and seeing education as a personal process, not as a process of simple data collection. That if we lose sight of that, then we've lost the plot entirely. And it can be done. This is the good news. And not only can it be done, it really has to be done. And that's the big challenge. I think the shift we have to make is to see education not as a mechanical process, but as an organic process. One where we create a revived culture of learning. Kids want to learn, but they're like all natural creatures. They need conditions under which they're most likely to do that. That's the great challenge, I think, for a better Chicago, to create those conditions in all of our schools where kids really want to learn, where they'll invest themselves in learning, and then they and we will feel the benefit of it. We still won't be able to predict the future very clearly, by the way, because the future is subject to all kinds of forces outside of our control. But we'll be giving our kids a future, and they'll be investing it back, I think, in the well-being of this great city. Thank you very much.